Greetings to everybody. Morning services. We're doing it, and it's working out great. The title of this message, if you want a title, is Jesus of Nazareth, and I will get into that a little bit more as we get into the message. There's lots of things we can learn from the life of Jesus, and this message is going to focus on him as the physical man, not as the part of him that was God. But what was it like to be a physical man, Jesus, what he went through? And there's many things that he mentioned. He was baptized, and he did baptizing. Although he didn't do the baptizing himself, his disciples helped with that. He was weary, he was hungry. He didn't receive any honor in his own community. He was angry and grieved at things. He had compassion on people. He was betrayed. Disciples left him. He was invited to dinner and then attacked, probably the entire purpose of the dinner. He was asked to judge people between people. He was distressed at times, greatly displeased with things his disciples did. And strangely enough, he may have even teleported. If you're not familiar with that one, I'll briefly point out where it's at. But none of those things are the things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to mention 4 areas, 3 of them that we can make sure that we are aware of and useful in our life. I appreciate the first half. It goes very well with the conclusion and the main thrust of this message. Let's talk about his early life. As we all know, in Luke 2, 41 through 50, it's a story of Jesus at age 12. They'd been to Jerusalem, went to the temple for the holy days, and his parents left. Oops, sorry about that. His parents left, and they were in a family group. They all took off, and they got ready to stop, and, well, where's Jesus? He wasn't with them. And that just goes to show the level of trust and confidence his parents had in him as a 12-year-old. He knew what the plans were. Family's going back to their hometown, and there's plenty of relatives there. He's in the group somewhere. And then when it actually came time to find him, no, he wasn't in the group somewhere. And you may not recall, but they spent 3 days in Jerusalem trying to find him. So for 4 days at least, he was by himself, taking care of himself, eating, finding a place to sleep, and spending his time in the temple discussing religious things with the teachers there. There's no stories about what his relationship with his siblings were when he was a young person, but I was a child, as all of you were, and I raised a couple of boys, and I know things that happened as a child. Now here's Jesus, never sinned, oldest brother, and he's got younger siblings, many of them, and you know that there were hijinks at times. Things went wrong. Things might have got broken. Things might have disappeared that weren't supposed to disappear. And yet, Jesus would have always been counted on to be the goody-good that would tell the truth. No, he's not going to cover for his siblings. No, I didn't take that. And if he did break something, yes, I did break that. And so his siblings probably were a little bit annoyed with him, even as children. There's no stories to back that up, but we know what it's like. But there is a story in John 2, 3 through 5. John 2, 3 through 5. And of course, this is just before his ministry. And you're all familiar with this story also. John 2, starting in verse 3. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Verse 4, and Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And 5, his mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there's something I'd like to point out here. In verse 4, it says woman. To us nowadays, that sounds highly disrespectful. The Greek for that is actually a term more of respect. In some translations, it says dear woman or dear lady. There are other translations where you read and it sounds very disrespectful in the way they translated it. So if you read something like that, it's probably a translation you should just flip over to the garbage truck, because there's probably a lot of other things they put in there that are off base. And verse 5 shows what his mother expected. Whatever he says, you do it. She knew, because she'd made a request of her son, that he was going to do it. And obviously she knew that somehow he's going to pull a rabbit out of the hat, so to speak. So maybe there had been some minor miracles inside the family. Maybe there hadn't. I don't know. So Jesus honored his mother. And that's something that we should always do, is honor our parents and have good family relations. But now I want to get into the three things that happened in his life. The first one, again, you're all very familiar with. Luke 4. Luke 4. But I want to point some things out in this recording of it that maybe we didn't look at quite in the same way. So we'll start in verse 13. Now this is Jesus. Just before his ministry began, he was tempted by Satan, fasted 40 days in the desert. And verse 13 reads, "Now when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time, being tempted for 40 days by the devil. And in those days he ate nothing, and afterward, when they had ended, he was hungry." Now it says every temptation in verse 13. We're familiar that there's 3 recorded in Matthew. There's only 2 recorded, I think, in Mark and Luke. But there's 3 recorded in Matthew. So was he only tempted 3 times? Well, verse 2 says being tempted for 40 days. So Satan was at him for the entire 40 days. And it also says in verse 3 that when he departed until an opportune time. So this wasn't the only time that Satan tempted Jesus, tried to derail him, tried to get him off track. And of course we know that quite often those opportune times probably came through the Pharisees and the scribes. Another thing, Mark mentions that while he was in the desert there were wild beasts. So I don't know what kind of wild beasts they had in the wilderness, but here Jesus is. Probably didn't have a nice tent with campfires and everything around him all the time. He might have been sleeping on the ground. He had to be concerned with the other wild beasts that were out there besides everything else. We know that he was tempted in all points like we are. In fact, more so. I have not been directly attacked by Satan, as far as I'm aware. Although I do believe we are tempted by situations and thoughts that are set up by evil spirits. So we do have to deal with that in our lives. But I'm quite sure that Satan hasn't come at me directly. I don't think I would have done as well as Jesus, and that's probably why that hasn't happened. But now I want to spend most of my time speaking on this other thing that we've probably overlooked. I know I overlooked it until I started looking at this a little closer. So if you turn with me with Mark chapter 1, right at the start of his ministry. Mark chapter 1. I know Mark 1's in here. There's something between Matthew and Mark 2. There it is. Mark 1, we'll read verses 21 through 24, and then jump down to a couple other ones, but we'll start with 21. Then they, Jesus and the disciples that were with him at the time, went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they, everybody in the synagogue, were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Now there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, verse 24, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And the reason I titled this Jesus of Nazareth is because that is when he was referred to as a person, as a man, as the physical man, they always called him Jesus of Nazareth. It was what was above the cross. This is Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there's many places in the Bible where he's called the Son of Man, and toward the end of his ministry, Son of David, which Son of David definitely implies the Messiah. But when they were not aware he was Messiah or denying that fact, they called him Jesus of Nazareth. And so he cast these demons out of the man, and dropping down to verse 28, and immediately his fame spread throughout all the region around Galilee. So last time I spoke, I talked about how he did miracles, and the miracles proved he was Messiah, and they pointed back to God. Immediately, as soon as he started his ministry, just casting out this demon, teaching, and boom, word went out. There's somebody special here. Something's going on. Now dropping down to verse 32, he's now in Peter's house. I skipped the part where he went to the house, healed Peter's mother. But at evening, it's evening now, Sabbath is over, so it's all right for people to do non-Sabbath things. At evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed. And the whole city was gathered together at the door. So we find out that right off the bat, people are just massing in Jesus' presence, coming to him for the blessings he gives them of healing, throwing out demons. In verse 35, now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. And that is what you'll see throughout all the stories of Jesus. Massive crowds. He needed time alone. He wasn't going to be complacent. He was going to keep up his prayer. And he'd have to go out in the morning, get away from people. Or sometimes he'd leave after night, spend the whole night. Let's go to Luke 5. Most of these ones I have in the message I'm giving today are right from early on in his ministry. I could spend entire sermon time just reading all the scriptures that talk about the multitudes and the crowds. Luke 5, verses 1 through 3. Luke 5, verses 1 through 3. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. Now I was curious, just what is a multitude? Because that's a term that's used repeatedly in the New King James Version. The Greek word is oklos. That's the root word. There's two different versions. Well, there's more than two versions of it, but there's two versions of it that are basically used. One is a singular version and one is a plural version. The plural version would be translated crowds, and the singular would be crowd or multitude. And the basic root word means a crowd or a multitude. It doesn't say how big that crowd or multitude is, but a crowd or a multitude. And so we see this word used again and again and again in the New Testament when it talks about Jesus. The multitudes, the multitude. Matthew 4, verse 25. You don't need to flip to that one. I'll just read it to you. It says, great multitudes followed him. And where did the multitudes come from? They came from Galilee. They came from Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. So these people came from the entire area. He spent his time, most of his time in Galilee, around Capernaum. Obviously, Simon Peter had a house there. It looks like Jesus had a house that he usually went to. It's called the house, or he went in a house. It doesn't say it's Simon Peter's house all the time. What might have been he had another house in Capernaum. He spent a lot of time around there, and they did have a house that he did go to when he was in Capernaum. So all these people from all around, a great multitudes. Let's go back to Mark 1. This time we'll read verses 40 and 45. Mark 1, verse 40. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying to him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. And verse 43 is strange. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way. Show yourself to the priest, offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now, if Jesus is doing miracles to prove that he's the Messiah and to give glory to God, why would he tell them, don't tell anybody what just happened? Well, the reason for that, and it's in other places you'll see this, toward the end of his ministry, one of the crowds wanted to make him king. And so Jesus knew that he couldn't let things get out of hand. If the crowd made him a king, the Romans would kill him. He had to keep things under control and try to keep from things spiraling out of hand too quickly. I thought I had it in here, but I see I don't. One of the places where I mentioned that he didn't have any honor in his own country. Right off the bat, when he was in Galilee, you'll probably remember some of the words he said, but at the end of that section, they were going to kill him. They tried to take him out to the brow of a hill and throw him off the hill and kill him. And that was right at the beginning of his ministry again. So Jesus had to have a little crowd control, so to speak. Verse 45 says, however, he went out and began to proclaim it freely. This is the leper that was just healed, and to spread the matter so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in a deserted place, and they came to him from every direction. So Jesus had no privacy. Every single day, from the time he started his ministry pretty much, there were crowds. They wanted to be healed. They wanted their demons. And he taught. He spent a lot of time teaching. So he was under constant pressure. In our lives nowadays, we think, wow, man, he said, I'm under so much stress. I'm under so much stress. Well, we go to work. We work 8 hours a day. Most of us, at the end of the 8 hours, it's all done. We go home. Some of us have jobs that, we take home with us, and it bothers us. We might have pressures from all different kinds of things around us. We don't have 1,000 people waiting outside the door when we step out like paparazzi. You step outside and boom, there they are. Jesus, please, Jesus, please. We don't have to deal with that. I mean, he didn't have a car he could get in. Whoosh. He was on foot, and they were on foot. Luke 5:16 says, so he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed, because the wilderness was the only place that he could have any peace and quiet. Why they didn't follow him into the wilderness, I don't know, but knowing people, it's kind of rough out in the wilderness, and there are wild beasts. We'll catch him when he gets back. He had more than 12 disciples. We always think, well, he had the 12 disciples. Luke 10 verse 1 says, and after these things the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. So even if he did withdraw from the crowds, he had a discipleship around him that was a pretty large crowd. We also know that when he was speaking in John, that a lot of disciples left him after he talked about the future of drinking his blood and eating his body in the Passover service. Couldn't handle it. So Jesus never really did have me time, so to speak, once he started his ministry, except for when he withdrew out into the wilderness. Because it talks about his disciples, at first they can't find him. Where are you? Where'd you go? We finally found you. But after a while, you get to feel that they knew, well, Jesus had to withdraw again, like when they'd get in a boat and take off without him. Another interesting thing in Luke 10, verse 17, it says, now it happened on a certain day as he was teaching that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by who had come out of every town of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. So now you have this crowd of people, and they're all there wanting him to do things for them. And seated throughout the crowd, like the parable of the tares among the wheat, are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. A lot like the morality police we see in the Muslim countries nowadays. These people were on top of everything all the time. You broke the Sabbath. You did this. Who said you could say that? You haven't been authorized to teach. Everywhere he went, constantly, you'll see that there were Pharisees that followed him. They were out when John the Baptist was baptizing people. They were out when Jesus was baptizing people. And they were out just about every time you read about it, they were out. What's he going to say? What can we get him on? Look at all these people following. This isn't good. So most of the time, if not all, Jesus was teaching and healing. There were enemies mixed in the crowd. Like I said, Satan disappeared until there was an opportune time to tempt him again. And he had his little tempters sprinkled throughout. Luke 6, 17 through 19. Luke 6, 17 through 19. We can read this together. Luke 6, verse 17. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. So when he healed people, somehow, some way, the power went out from him. Now, I don't know. I know as a physical human being, I get tired, I get wore down. I know that there's times when God can give you a lift. If you pray about it, God, I'm just exactly worn, just completely worn out, and maybe he'll help you get through the day. Of course, we know that Jesus was much more of that power, and evidently a little bit of that power drained constantly in doing the good that he did to the people around him. We're all familiar with the story in Mark 5, verses 25 through 30, of the woman who had a flow of blood. And again, he was in a great big crowd. There's so many people around. She reached out, if I can just touch him, I'll be healed. And she did touch him. And he felt the power go out of him. And the disciples, when he said something, the disciples said, well, what do you mean? There's hundreds of people around you. What do you mean somebody touched me? But it was an obvious thing that he could feel when the power went out after him. So let's look at Mark 6 and see something interesting. Mark 6. Now this is after he had sent the apostles out. I just read the account of where he'd sent 70 others out, but he had originally sent the 12 apostles out 2 by 2, and they had just come back from being out. Mark 6, verse 30. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. Verse 31, and he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. Because he knew what it was like to be teaching, to be healing, to be casting out demons. And his apostles had just gone through this very thing. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So again, the crowds are constantly, didn't even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. So this, we think of Jesus doing all this good stuff. It was a drain. It was a physical, we're talking about the physical man here. It was a physical drain on him. He became tired. He became weary. So, size of multitudes. Is there anything in the scriptures at all that gives us the idea of the size of the multitudes? And of course, probably 2 stories come to mind right off the bat. Mark 6:33. This is a story of feeding the 5,000. Mark 6:33, I'll read it to you. But the multitudes again, saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. And they arrived before them and came together to him. So what to give you the background on this, he's over here on one part of the lake, and they depart. The multitude said, hey, they're taking off. We know where they're going. And they ran around the lake and got to the other side before they got there on the boats. So they get off the boats, and there they are. And Jesus came out. He saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And when you drop down to 44, now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. 5,000 men. As it says in Matthew, when he talked about the 4,000, it says, now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides the women and children. So we're talking a stadium full of people following Jesus around. Stadium full. It's a lot of people. 10, 15,000 people. Oh, I do have it in here. Jesus' life being in danger. Another thing he had to deal with. In Luke 4, 14 through 16, we can turn there because there'll be several scriptures we're going to read. Luke chapter 4. Then Jesus returned, verse 14, returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news of him went out through all the surrounding region. So Jesus had been teaching, been healing people, been casting out demons, so he comes back to his home area. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. And so he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went in the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And so we'll drop down to verse 28. So all those in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath, and rose up and thrust him out of the city, and they led him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built, that they might throw him down over the cliff. In verse 30, then passing through the midst of them, he went his way. So Jesus obviously had a miracle here. Everybody knew him. This was where he grew up. And yet, when the crowd had him, we're going to throw him off the cliff, he just walked through the middle of them. Don't know what kind of miracle that was. If they were kind of blinded like they were in Sodom and couldn't see. If they just didn't recognize him like on the road to Emmaus. But needed a miracle very early in his life to keep from getting killed. And if you drop down to Mark 10, I want to go into this one. Mark 10, verse 32. It says, now, when they were on the road, this is Jesus and his disciples. Now, this is toward the end of his ministry. This is just before the Passover. When they were on the road going up to Jerusalem and Jesus was going before them, they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Because for well over 6 months now, and pretty much through his entire ministry, but especially toward the end, the Pharisees have been trying to figure out how to kill Jesus. You'll remember that the last Feast of Tabernacles, his brothers were chiding him. Are you going to go up to Jerusalem and teach? Because they knew that the Pharisees were after him. He's a little bit afraid now. He's not going to go up to Jerusalem and teach. But he did go up and he did teach. So the disciples knew that they want to kill this guy. And we're with him. And they knew what happened if there was an insurrection. They didn't just kill the guy at the top of the insurrection. They killed the people that supported him too. So disciples knew what was going on and they were afraid. And so going on in the verse, he says, then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them things that would happen to him. So here we see that Jesus knew exactly beforehand when and how he was going to die. Of course, this isn't news to us. We knew that. But if you knew exactly when and how you were going to die, how would it affect your life? And if you knew you were going to die brutally, how would it affect you? What kind of stress would you be under the days and weeks ahead of time? And Jesus spells it right out in verses 33 and 34. Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, which is the Romans. And they will mock him and scourge him, spit on him, and kill him. And the third day he'll rise again. In John 12, verses 32 through 33. It says, this is Jesus speaking to the crowd. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. And this he said, signifying what death he would die. So he knew he was going to be crucified. He knew he was going to end up on a pole. But verse 27 is interesting. John 12, verse 27. It says, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. And yet we know, as a physical human being, when that hour came, he said, Father, if possible, can this cup pass from me? Not my will, but your will be done. So even though less than a week ahead of time, he says, what am I going to do? Ask the Father that I don't come to this? And yet when he came to it as a human, he couldn't help but say, is there any other way? Can we get out of this? But he knew he couldn't. So Jesus was a sober-minded child, obedient. He was tempted directly and probably frequently by Satan. He had to put up with Pharisees' accusations. He had to put up with people acclaiming him. You're the Messiah, you're our king. Because people said, in other places, the people said, well, right after he said, if I'm lifted up, and people said, well, the Messiah's not going to die. The Messiah is going to, be the king of Israel and lead us to glory. Who is the Son of Man that's going to die? They didn't understand. So they wanted him to be king. They wanted him to be the Messiah. They wanted him to bring Israel out from underneath Roman's thumb. And he was surrounded by attempted violence against him. He was constantly surrounded by large crowds to the point of exhaustion. He was drained of power from healing them, and yet he was moved to compassion for them. And he had to live with the knowledge of when and how he would die. And it's not just knowledge he had at the end, it was knowledge he had most of his life. I don't know when everything clicked into place. Obviously, as a 3-day-old child, he didn't know all this, but it came to him with the Spirit and everything. And yet Jesus lived without sin. Yes, we can do better if we will just totally rely and trust in God, who has all power. So draw near to God while he may be found, and let's be overcomers.